This is the war in Russia through the eyes of Otto Carius, one of Germany's most distinguished tank commanders. This is the end for Nazi Germany. Let's begin. From our positions, we could observe how the Volkssturm was leaving its lines and streaming back into the city. The war was over for these men. The Americans peacefully advanced in long columns along the Ruhr highway toward Dortmund. Using my scope, I could observe how the women and girls were waving to the liberators. White flags were suddenly waving everywhere. The city, as quiet as a grave just a little before, came back to life. A line from Deutschland über alles, suddenly sprang to mind. German women, German fidelity. What did we soldiers care if others raised the white flag? We didn't want to break our oath to be the same as rotten scoundrels. I had to employ a trick to get more fuel. In a display of German thoroughness, the Feldwebel on duty in a supply depot referred to his regulations. I bawled him out when he did that. Let me then see your paybook, please. That way I can report to Feldmarschall Model, who is responsible for me not being able to move my remaining vehicles. I immediately received fuel in abundance. I had so much that I wasn't able to drive it all off before the Ruhr pocket finally went up in smoke. Despite the aircraft, we were able to get back to our unit in one piece. We then continued to advance to the rear. By then the pocket was so small that at least the communications functioned well. There had been scarcely any contact between Model and his divisions in the previous few weeks. I set up my next-to-last command post in a house right next to a railroad line. We slept on the floor. I had scarcely nodded off when a terrible blast ripped through the air. Of course, we immediately assumed it was enemy bombers, but it was a German railway gun that was sending its last greetings over our heads to the north. We made ourselves scarce before the fighter bombers came, especially since the railway gun had disappeared into a tunnel. During my last contact with the enemy, I also experienced surrendering a village for the first time, with a truce and everything else that goes with it. I had only known about this from hearsay. It was something that those who had only experienced the Eastern Front had never considered possible. We were covering a larger village. I had the order to hold it at all costs for as long as possible because the Ruhr pocket would have collapsed after giving up this critical point. The Americans didn't appear to be ready for any more resistance and came driving up the road with their tanks. After we had knocked out the first few, no more let themselves be seen. For doing that, the head doctor of the hospitals came racing out of the village. He vehemently reproached me because we had even bothered to shoot. The hospitals were full to the rafters. Even the private homes were occupied with wounded. The entire village, the head doctor said, was like a large field hospital. It was then completely clear to me that we had to evacuate without a fight, even though I also knew that the pocket would collapse with the surrender of this position. Despite that, I decided to deal with the Americans. When I took off toward the enemy with my Feldwebel, I had an uncomfortable feeling in the pit of my stomach. That was a leftover from my time in Russia. What had the Red Cross meant there? Here, however, the weapons were quiet because both sides were attending to their wounded. The matter didn't go down too well with my Feldwebel either. He was fearful for me and kept on talking to me about it. But everything went well. The Americans had dismounted from their tanks, probably so we didn't have any fears. I was received by the commander of the tank unit, who had a Jewish translator with him. Of course, the first question was, USS. I was able to calm the good man down. He most likely believed that a bloodthirsty scoundrel was hiding behind the uniform of every member of the Waffen-SS. I assured him that we tankers had worn the death's head on our uniforms well before the SS units. I then expressed my desires, and the American lieutenant drove along to our corps as an intermediary. He didn't say a word during the ride. When I asked him whether he belonged to such and such an armor regiment because this number was sewn to his sleeve, he answered succinctly that he hadn't asked me for the number of our regiment. His answer was probably quite proper. I was only surprised, however, that the Americans also wore their numbers in combat. By point of contrast, our insignia had disappeared during the war. Everything was discussed at Corps, and the evacuation was approved. Why should we have continued the senseless endangerment of the wounded? It should be noted that the American didn't take a cigarette from our general, let alone something to drink. Were they that afraid of us? It was then laid out exactly how the Americans would occupy the city while we left it. The time of the truce was set precisely. I felt like I was on a football field at halftime. I brought the lieutenant back and bid farewell to the commander of the American Armored Advance Guard. He wanted to offer me a cup of coffee and was amazed when I declined. Then he asked me why we were continuing to fight at all. I gave him my answer. As a soldier and an officer, I probably really didn't need to give him an explanation for it. He advised me to protect my men, since we would soon require every soldier for the execution of joint missions. This remark gave me some hope again. It could only refer to a joint campaign against Russia, after all. Perhaps reason would triumph over hate among our Western opponents. That was probably also the case among the enemy combat troops. Unfortunately, the politicians had the last word. I had scarcely driven out of the village with my tanks when the Russians, who had been prisoners in the camps, began to plunder and descend like animals on the civilian population. I had to turn to the Americans again with a request to bring about order. They cleaned up like I never would have dreamed possible. The Russians were soon behind barbed wire again. This ruthless proceeding allowed me to believe even more that the Western powers would march against the East after our capitulation. After another 2 days, I ended up in the village where I had stayed in the hospital. Everything looked different from back then. The place looked like an army camp because everyone who hadn't been taken prisoner yet was heading there. Nobody thought about putting up a defense anymore. We were in a patch of woods. Our maintenance squad was working on our last hunting tigers. The news then came that the Americans were in the village. We blew up the barrels of our assault guns. I had the company assemble for the last time. I cannot express in words how I felt at this last formation and what the faces of the soldiers revealed to me when we said goodbye. A few still wanted to break through, but we all saw one another in the camps again. Feldmarschall Model escaped being taken prisoner by committing suicide in some woods near Duisburg. How unfortunate for this wonderful troop commander. Even he hadn't been able to prevent the defeat. It was a comfort to me that this exemplary soldier escaped delivery to the Russians through his suicide. That certainly would have taken place after his being taken prisoner. He didn't want to live through the collapse of his homeland. We followed the news from the Eastern Front up until the end. We continued to have the opportunity in our hospital, the Golden Cage, to hear the last German radio stations. We were glad that our comrades in the East continued to fight on bitterly to hold up Ivan for as long as possible. Unfortunately, their sacrifices were in vain. The Americans stopped at the Elbe. Our hopes for a joint struggle against the Russians dwindled with that. How easy this advance would have been, and how willingly our units would have marched to the east. All the units were still together. The Yanks would only have had to take over the supply. The last opportunity to lead a low-risk preventive war was thrown away when, blinded by hate, they allied themselves with the devil against Germany. The only goal that held the Allies together had been reached. Germany ceased to exist. The Americans could not have won the war anyway. It had already been decided before their intervention. They had the option of losing the peace. Gross Admiral Dönitz spoke on the radio after the announcement of Hitler's death. The officers gathered with the doctors in the officers' club. We had all put on our uniforms one more time, and we knew that it was the last time. A few days later, by order of the Americans, the first inmates of the hospital were evacuated to a prison camp. Together with a slightly wounded Oberstleutnant, I volunteered and left with another 6 officers. This was the first time we were to get acquainted with the American soldiers, whom we, more or less, had only heard rumors about in combat. Technological progress is to be welcomed. When it serves as a replacement for good upbringing, however, then the behavior looks like what we had to experience at the hands of the enemy officers and soldiers. Only men who had not participated in combat could act in such a manner. These were men who only judged us by the atrocity propaganda. Not only the losing, but also the winning, a war demands human greatness. This greatness was completely missing in our opponents. I had the impression that the occupying powers wanted to prove at all costs that they weren't better than we were, rather worse. We were then rounded up by the thousands on a playing field. That meant that hardly anyone had the opportunity to stretch out. There were no rations, even though our units had brought fully loaded trucks along. These were pushed over and the food burned. Even worse, not a drop of water was brought. Not until a mutiny threatened to break out were a few soldiers allowed to fetch a small container of water. When the desired liquid came, a major attempted in vain to create order so everyone could get something. That worked for the old soldiers, but the Yanks had also snatched up civilians who immediately rebelled and ran like cattle toward the container. They simply let the water run, and in the end, nobody at all had a drop. A few days later, the recently amputated were brought to us because the entire hospital had been ordered to be evacuated. Dressings were not furnished. We cut up our blankets to help our comrades as best we could. They died truly wretched deaths, and we had to watch them die without being able to help. At night, our lives were in danger, even if we were only moving around. They immediately opened fire if someone wanted to go to the bathroom. I personally saw how 3 soldiers lost their lives in this manner before they had even crossed the marked line. Those were the liberators who wanted to teach us to be humane. The so-called interrogations were also something else. The men were supposed to give statements on things about which they had absolutely no idea. They were put in holes in the ground that came to a point at the bottom. They had to endure that for as long as it took until they admitted their crimes. They had others kneel on sharp iron surfaces to break their resistance. What actually happened in Remagen, Kreuznach, Landau, or even in the SS camps or during the infamous Malmedy trials could give a few concentration camp guards some good tips. Fate was merciful to me, by the way. I was soon released because of my miserable appearance. I borrowed a civilian coat, gave my occupation as a farmer's apprentice, and my address as that of my uncle, the doctor. I thus showed up unexpectedly as a free man at my uncle's hospital. We were both happy to see one another, and the doctors envied me because they were still prisoners. But for me, the war was really over. A new life had begun. Meanwhile, many years have passed. The allies of today have evolved from the enemies of yesterday, from the hate that the Western powers brought against the German combat soldier, a hate that they continued to let us feel for many years after the armistice, has come the recognition that this German soldier did nothing but his duty for 4.5 years, properly, bravely, and loyally. That our own country repeatedly fails to recognize this is another story. It will remain a blemish on our people for all times. The old spirit of combat comradeship could not be eliminated, despite all the humiliation that we were subjected to and all the injustice that we endured. Shared suffering binds you, shared experience obligates you. Whom should it have surprised, then, that we tankers tried to get in contact with one another after our return from captivity? I was very lucky to be one of the first to come home. I experienced great happiness there because our entire family had survived the war in one piece. It was an unforgettable day. My father had arrived the evening before. He had found my brother and my mother there. On the following evening, we were all happily reunited. Although none of us had known anything of the others, we had all returned home within 24 hours of each other. Fate was thus merciful to us. The first one from our old unit that I was able to establish contact with was Delzeit. Kostler, Rieger, Stadler, and many more followed. Today we have contacted more than 50 men from our tank unit. We celebrated our first get-together as a small group in Holzkirchen, near Munich. Our comrades from Austria also came. In 1955, we met in Seewaldchen on the Attersee and brought our wives along to this gathering. We decided then to get together again every year at Pentecost, and not to rest or slack off until one day all the members of the 2nd Company of the 502nd Heavy Tank Battalion have gathered together. This book is dedicated to those soldiers and especially to our dead comrades who are always among us at our gatherings. This concludes the 28th and last part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more stories and leave a comment.